and oh my goodness, and vote on, etc. So let me just get the Menti started. Okay. Does that look like the Menti to everyone? Fantastic. There we go. Right, so as I said, you can join on your own device and follow the slides that way. If you join at menti.com, and the code for today is 2582494, and that will remain at the top of the screen. So if we get to the voting or contribution parts, you can just put that in at that time. Okay, so let's move forward. So I'm going to set the theme around grade inflation and explain what we're talking about. Then I'm going to have a quick look at what grade inflation means in accounting and finance, what we know about it and what we don't know about it, and leave you with some concluding thoughts. So I hope that's okay. But first of all, I'd like to ask you what you think might be contributing to grade increases in accounting and finance. I've carefully said increases. I'll give you a little bit longer as it builds into the word cloud. So it's interesting, actually, what has come up here, that actually there's quite a lot of external pressures almost driving institutional practice. So we can see progression rates, which we know are in the Office for Students' Conditions, got rankings, which obviously the student outcomes feed into rankings. Student satisfaction, yes, as they're increasingly portrayed as consumers and of education. Change marking practice, yes, and we saw quite a lot of changes during the pandemic. Popularity, yes, I think so. And student expectations, yes, I'm sure we've all sat there and had the I deserve whatever discussion with students on various assignments. And so it's fair to say that there's not just one thing potentially contributing. We're seeing quite a lot of different factors which are putting pressure on institutions and individuals working in the sector. So let's move on. I just Googled grade inflation and pasted down a number of different headlines that I've found. And you can see that in the eyes of the popular media, that there is grade inflation. And with headlines saying a quarter of sixth formers with 3 Ds achieve a first, those headlines are designed to alarm and capture, you know, public opinion about the higher education sector. And of course, that then creates expectations with our students. and what their outcomes are going to be. So there is a pressure and impressions management side of things here as well, where students are entering higher education with expectations that may not be wholly fulfilled. And the general public are thinking that grade inflation is rife, that everyone's getting a first, yet we note that that's not necessarily the reality of what we're looking at, and that it's a much more complex issue. So moving forwards, what I've done is I've used the chart from the Office for Students annual report, which shows the change in proportion of degrees awarded between 2010 11 and 21-22. And what you can see on this chart is that firsts have gone from 15.5%, the yellow blob on the very far left, all the way up to 32.8% in 21-22. And correspondingly, 2-1s went from 50.9% in 2010-11 up to, or down, sorry, down to 46.8% in 21-22. Now, it's important to realise that this chart and charts like this that come out of the Office for Students are focusing on home students only, and they don't include the results for our international students. So it's domestic students only that are included in these stats, and it's important to read very carefully who's included and who's excluded in a lot of the discourse around grade inflation and awarding gaps as well, because the data sets are really, really important. And just for everyone's information, the Office for Students terms first class degrees and upper 2-1s as good degrees. So when you see in the press, the 79.6% of students in 21-22 got a good degree, that's what they mean, either a first or a 2-1. And there's significant disparities amongst subgroups within that. The Office for Students has focused on what they call unexplained grade inflation. And they calculate this by controlling for entry criteria and I think some other demographic criteria as well, which is why it's important that this is home students, because that's often the data set they're looking at. So they're looking at, for example, A levels as a predictor of degree outcome. And that's how they then decide or have calculated what an unexplained grade inflation is at the sector level. Now, of course, that can be criticised in many respects and has been quite extensively in the academic and policy area, that it doesn't include factors like good teaching, for example, and some other potential explanators. So it's saying almost your destiny in Office for Students terms can be predicted based on your A levels, which of course isn't necessarily the case, and there's lots of arguments that can be presented there. The other thing that I think is relevant at this point is to highlight that under the Office for Students B conditions, that assessments need to be valid and reliable, and that relevant awards granted to students must be credible at the point of being granted and when compared to those granted previously. Yet if we look at the prior slide, where we can see this big jump in proportion of first class degrees, we might start to question that. So I think we might see some more regulatory pushback on degree awards. and it's definitely something to consider in the discussion around grade inflation, whether that B condition is being upheld. So what does this look like for accounting and finance? Well, I took some of the HESA data that's available and try to have a look at it for our discipline to try and put this into context as to whether we're in line with the general sector or out of line. Now, the big difference in my data set, which I took from HESA, is that it does include the international students. And when I started to dig into it in a little bit more detail, I didn't have time to create another slide, but what I did do was note down the differences in first between domestic students and what's termed by HESA as non-EU students. There are EU students in the mix as well, but I'm not going to pick up on those right now. So the home students in 21-22, 37% were awarded a first, but non-EU students, it was 25%. And in terms of good degrees, home students, 78% were awarded a 2-1. Oh no, overall, sorry. Yeah, good overall was 78% for home, and non-EU was 72%. So that there is a clear international awarding gap that we're seeing within accounting and finance. And I suspect it's the same in the overall data as well. And the other thing I think is relevant is that the overall number of graduates over that 3-year period reduced by 6%. So overall, in accounting and finance subjects, now those, as I'm sure everyone is aware, are based on the mappings that HESA makes. So there may be other degrees in there. There may not just be accounting and finance at Manchester. It may be also something or other with accounting and accounting at Manchester. As an example, and I'm sure anyone who's seen the HESA mappings will know, but I think it's the best we have to know for our sector, our discipline, what that looks like. And we have 15, approximately in 21-22, we had about 15,500 students and were the biggest contributor to the business and management broader discipline. So moving on, let's start to try to discuss what could be contributors. And I don't think there's any definitive information. Yes, exactly, Darren. COVID and safety nets provided will have inflated grades, yeah. That's true. There are a number of different contributors that we can think about and discuss, and really I'm just going to introduce them with the expectation that they start to open out the discussion that we'll have later on, rather than with any definitive view coming from me as to the extent to which they contribute to what we're seeing. So firstly, quality standards. We know the quality standards have been set by the Framework of Higher Education Qualifications, and they're maintained in our respective institutions through the institutional regulations and the practices around moderation and marking. And we know that external examining has an important role to play, but also we know that that's been criticised in the past. And there is a whole series of papers written by Bloxham and Price on that. The other thing I think I'd like to say is Advanced HE engaged in quite a lot of work around external examining over the last, I guess, 3 or 4 years, and that project's now been handed over to the Office for Students. And started training courses around becoming a registered external examiner. So trying to put in place CPD and maintain a register of people who had gone through this course, which had been funded by the Degree Standards Project. And interestingly, when I did that course some time ago now, one of the examples is talking about social calibration and calibration within disciplines. And what pops up is a bunch of Australian accounting academics. I'm going to play a short clip from that next, so you can see, and you'll see some familiar faces who many of us on this call will recognise. The video is slightly old, but I think it's an interesting concept, and it might be something that we want to initiate in our discipline. I know that the Chartered Association of Business Schools did run some calibration event with business and management studies discipline. The other thing around some of the quality or some of these activities is that they're very focused on the module level. And I want you to hold that thought, because one of the future things I'm going to talk about is the degree algorithm.
Calibration activities portrayed in this video relate to an initiative that has been active since 2011. It involves 40% of Australian universities. The main trigger was the inclusion in legislation that all universities and higher education providers must provide evidence of external benchmarking achievement of student learning outcomes, similar to external examination in some other countries. A key enabler to doing this effectively was calibration activities, because the literature shows low inter-rater reliability, even among experienced academics. The subject or discipline in focus is accounting, who had previously developed a benchmark statement of threshold learning outcomes or standards. Participants are mostly senior experienced academic accountants with a handful of professional accounting practitioners and some representatives from the professional accounting bodies. Before this calibration workshop, participants have remotely assessed or graded the same 3 samples of student work. They've provided reasons for their judgments against whether it met the standard or not, and advised what improvements were needed. In this case, it was about communicating accounting advice and ideas. Judgments and reasons are confidentially entered via an online system. Also, participants have remotely compared their judgments, their reasons and advice with de-identified peers via the same online system. Now, participants are aware that they and their experienced peers are not all of one mind. The first part of the video shows participants reaching consensus as a group or team assembled around a table in relation to one student's work.
And I'm going to stop it there. You can watch the disagreements and agreements as they come to a view of what the various marks should be. And it's quite an interesting exercise that they undertook. So that's one way that we might be able to have a disciplinary view in terms of calibrating marks. And I thought it was quite interesting, particularly since it had accounting academics. Okay, so as I said, a lot of the work or a lot of the focus is at the module level, yet modules are mixed together into a degree using a degree algorithm. And those degree algorithms vary significantly across institutions. So the paper that I've referenced found that there were 36 different algorithms in operation across the UK at the time that they did a study. I think it was in 2019. And differences include whether the first year is included. It is at some institutions, and my own would be one of those. Whether credits can be dropped, and if so, how many credits and at which level. The weightings of the years, there's a wide variety in terms of the weightings. So the institution I used to work at was 40-60. So it placed increased weight on the final year with what is argued to be an exit velocity. But there are lots of different weightings that are in operation across the sector. So one of the implications of this is that students with the same module marks can have different degree outcomes depending on what institution they are studying at. And I think in some respects we need to start to disaggregate whether we're seeing uplifts at the module level, and if so, what the contributors might be at a module level, or if we're seeing uplifts and awarding gaps in some respects being created by the degree algorithms themselves. Because I think there's a layering that's going on as all these things are combined into the final degree outcome. So the next thing I'd like to touch on is enhancement activity. We have to believe that at some point, some of the work that we've been doing around improving our teaching, our assessment literacy, the focus of our students is contributing to improved performance. That the significant work that institutions undertake around student transitions, making the hidden curriculum more visible, reducing awarding gaps is having an effect, and may well be contributing to uplifts in degree outcomes. And there's papers that have been written on this as well. So I've tried to reference a handful of papers as I've gone through this, but obviously there is a rich literature in many of these areas. So I picked up this quote from Fogarty's paper from a couple of years ago, and he says, the degree inflation that the pandemic period caused will scarcely be noticed, if only because it is a contribution to an ongoing trend. And I suppose we should be questioning whether that is the case, or whether something fundamentally shifted during the pandemic. And there's lots of research that's starting to come out trying to disaggregate the effect of the pandemic and the safety net type policies that were put in place, and of course they're institution specific, and changes to assessment modes, which of course could be another contributor. Which leads me on to the next point I'd like to consider. With some colleagues, we looked at students and the effect of no detriment policy that was in place at one UK institution, and the changes to the assessments with a big data set of all the students. And what we found was that some groups benefited from the changes to the assessments, but not all groups. And of course, I think the one qualifier I'd like to put on this work is that it was done, it looked at that sudden change. And of course, the assessments, there may have been other things rather than just the assessment mode contributing to students performing better on certain types of assessment. So it could be that we as academics explained assessments better because of the pandemic situation that we were in and the fact that we were remote. It could be that the assessments were set differently, and if we did that same study now, we might find something else because we're more of a steady state. We've had more practice setting some of these assessment types. So lots and lots of considerations there. But I think for me, it's important that we start to look at into the detail of big data sets to try to understand what is happening and what contributors might be to uplifts in assessment. And of course, that means digging into module level data, which is big. Once you have a large graduating cohort, and then multiply up by the number of modules they've got, the number of sits they had, the ones who had resits, suddenly you have a huge data set. But I think it's important, if we're going to come to conclusions, that we are starting to move in that direction. So moving on, I wanted to highlight this. It's not a study, it was actually a post in the Edinburgh University. They have a blog, or a sort of small teaching and learning snippets that they share by Michael Daw, who did this work with biomedical students at Edinburgh University. Over 152 assessments he was looking at, and that equated to 13,745 submissions, 13,745 submissions. So he had quite a lot of data. And initially, what he was interested in was whether the style of the mark scheme made a difference to the range of outcomes. So he was looking at that, but then became more interested in the type of assessments. And what this chart shows is that there's a huge difference in the range. And bearing in mind this is marks above 80%, that for a lot, the full range isn't being used necessarily. For others, it's going all the way to the top. And one of his reflections was that he felt that by setting essays in his own practice, that would allow students to differentiate themselves from others. But if you look at that, if you look at here, it doesn't appear to, because there are very few students getting over the 80% mark, whereas in other types of assessment, there are many more. And I'm sure many of us will have things to say around experiences when we've sat on exam boards and looked at assessment types and the range of marks being awarded. So I'm not going to steal Paul's thunder on academic integrity, other than say that online assessment integrity is clearly harder to maintain in many respects, particularly without proctoring. And of course, proctoring has its own drawbacks. And also that AI is introducing new challenges for us that we're all grappling with right now, and no doubt there will be lots and lots of stories around assessment and feedback and marks distributions and probably contributions to grade inflation and so on coming into the sector as this academic year progresses, linked to the use of generative AI in assessments. So I wanted to say a few bits about what don't we know. Well, we don't know whether accounting and finance as a discipline is displaying similar or different drivers to the sector as a whole. And that could be a very fruitful area for investigation. And also, in what ways is accounting and finance the same or different? We don't have a clear view on how inequities are being created by institutional policy. So, for example, the degree algorithms I mentioned, but also the assessment modes, because each institution has a slightly different menu of assessment modes, and we all know and love that menu in our own institutions, whether it's restrictive or quite permissive. That varies quite significantly. Exceptional circumstance policies vary quite significantly and can be a source of inequity. And also borderline rules can push push students up over the grade boundaries, and some are more generous than others. Some have borderlines up to 3%. Others have it rounded to 0.5, and it's either above or below. So huge amount of variation in practice at the institutional level. We don't have, or we don't definitively have a clear calculation of what might be termed value add by accounting and finance degrees. And I wouldn't just take the A-level grade plus degree outcome, which of course is one of the inputs, I think, into the Guardian rankings tables. But I would say, how do we interpret and calculate value by accounting and finance degrees? And also, we don't know the impact of academic misconduct to the outcomes that we see within our discipline, but also, I guess, beyond. But is it more prevalent in accounting and finance? Do we see more or less academic misconduct in our disciplinary area? And is that linked to the assessment modes that we're using, or is it not? So what actions do you or are you taking? What do you think we should be doing about this, or are you doing about it? Good suggestion. So some good suggestions there. I think it's a combination of things. I don't think what we're seeing, or actually being able to understand the contributors and I guess the weighting of those contributors, is an easy thing. And it will be likely there will be an institutional element as well, because of the assessment regulations that come into play around the degree awarding levels. Yeah, strengthen external examining, yes. Yeah. I think someone in the chat mentioned the GPA, which I think is interesting, because obviously that would take the raw, effectively the module marks. But I had a very cursory look at GPA and how it's calculated, and I noticed that some overseas institutions, it's not just straight GPA over the whole degree. Some of them discount, some of them weight years differently as well. So it may not be as simple as one might think. But yes, I think investigation at the modular level without necessarily having that degree algorithm overlay might be a fruitful avenue to follow. No more exams. Fantastic. So some really good suggestions there that from colleagues. So here are my concluding thoughts. Reflecting on what I've just said, I think more research is required at the discipline level, at the modular level, with longitudinal data sets, and evidence-based approaches to assessment are really need to be thought about, because otherwise I think we could just be following trends and you know, working on perhaps outcomes rather than causes. The references are at the end of the presentation. You should be able to access everything through the Menti link. So I'm not going to dwell on those. I can take some questions now, or we can move on to Paul's presentation.